discuss the growing tribalism with Republican Senator Ben Sasse and with Corey Lewandowski and David Bossie, outside advisors to the president, who say Mr. Trump's enemies, including some top officials in the White House, are undermining him. Plus, our Sunday panel tackles a new administration report on climate change that presents the grimmest picture yet of the threat to the U.S. All right now on Fox News Sunday. And hello again from Fox News in Washington. As family and friends get together on this Thanksgiving weekend, there's one piece of advice a lot of people are taking. Don't talk politics. Views about President Trump and hot-button issues are so divisive, you run the risk of blowing up the family gathering. Now, as we head into the 2020 race for president, will this growing tribalism get even worse? In a few minutes, we'll sit down with two outside advisors to the president, Corey Lewandowski and David Bossie, for their first interview on their new book about Mr. Trump's enemies. But first, from Nebraska, Republican Senator Ben Sasse, a frequent critic of the president and author of his own new book, Them: Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal. Senator, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thanks for coming to snowy Nebraska, Chris.
Okay. Senator, we'll get to your book about political tribalism in a moment, but I want to start discussing another threat, and that is the 13 federal agencies came out with something called the National Climate Assessment on Friday, and here are the major findings from that assessment. Temperatures in the U.S. are 1.8 degrees higher than 100 years ago. Seas are 9 inches higher. Heat waves, hurricanes, and wildfires are much worse. And climate change could cut our GDP by 10% by 2100 if there are no changes. Senator, how seriously do you take this report from the Trump administration?
Well, I think it's clear that the climate is changing. I think reasonable people can differ about how much and how rapidly. But I think it's clear that it's changing, and it's clear that humans are a contributing factor. I think the real question, though, becomes what do you do about it? Because you can't legislate or regulate your way into the past. We have to innovate our way into the future. And right now, you don't hear a lot of the people who put climate as their #1 issue. You don't hear a lot of them offering constructive, innovative solutions for the future. It's usually just a lot of alarmism. But I think the report is important, and it shows that the climate is changing.
But, for instance, you oppose what you call EPA overreach, including President Obama's climate change plan. According to the report, rolling that back, which would limit greenhouse gas emissions, is exactly the wrong approach.
Yeah, well, I think we have to recognize that this is a global issue, and China and other countries that are rapidly building middle classes are going to be the #1 drivers in the long term. So what the U.S. needs to do is participate in a long-term conversation about how you get to innovation. And it's going to need to be a conversation, again, that doesn't start with alarmism, but that starts with some discussion of the magnitude of the challenge, the global elements to it, and how the U.S. shouldn't just do this as a feel-good measure, but some sort of innovative proposal. And right now, that's not really what I get from most of the people who make this a top 2 or 3 issue for themselves.
But just quickly, and I want to move on to other subjects, China, for instance, is trying to grow into the future and has become a huge investor in solar panels. There was an international agreement in which countries made commitments, the Paris Climate Accord, and the president is going to pull us out of that. So isn't much of the rest of the world actually moving faster than we are?
So I want to distinguish between the two parts of your answer. I think the first part about Chinese investment does show part of the way forward. The U.S. needs to have a long-term investment and innovation strategy. That's true. But things like the Paris Climate Accords tend to be more binding on us than on other nations. And so that's not good for the U.S. consumer, and it's not a long-term solution. But conversations like that are certainly important going forward.
All right. Let's turn to another big story this week, and that is what role Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman may or may not have played in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and what the U.S. should do about it. The CIA has, according to reports this week, concluded that MBS was involved, but President Trump challenges that. Here he is.
The CIA points it both ways. And as I said, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But I will say very strongly that It's a very important ally.
Senator, what do you think of President Trump's conclusion that basically comes down to this: regardless of what MBS did, we need to continue doing business with Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, it was a very weak statement. I think we need to distinguish between two things. There are a whole bunch of bad guys in the Middle East, and if you want to make a hardcore realist case, and I think this is some of what the president is trying to hint at there, that there are places and times when our and Saudi's interests temporarily align, and sometimes you have to work with bad guys in the world, there's a coherent realist case to be made there. Saudi, I often refer to them as the second worst players in the Middle East, second only to Iran. But that's a different thing. Making a realist case is a different thing than being so weak that we fail to tell the truth. MBS contributed to murdering somebody abroad, and it is not strength to sort of mumble past that. Strength is telling the truth even when it's hard. Fortunately, we have a U.S. intelligence community that's really good, and a lot of us in the first branch of government, the Article 1 branch, the Congress, have heard from the intelligence community, and I'll be getting another classified briefing on Tuesday about this, and our intelligence community is really good, and the report is really clear, and the president should be stronger. That was a weak statement.
Another subject. The president got into a remarkable face-off this week with Chief Justice John Roberts after a federal judge issued a nationwide ban on President Trump's new policy that would basically bar asylum for anybody who crosses into the country illegally. Here's President Trump on that.
This was an Obama judge, and I'll tell you what, it's not going to happen like this anymore.
Chief Justice Roberts responded with this statement: "We do not have Obama judges or Trump judges, Bush judges or Clinton judges. What we have is an extraordinary group of dedicated judges doing their level best to do equal right to those appearing before them." Your reaction, sir, to the dust-up between the president and the Chief Justice?
Well, first of all, it is clearly the case that there are a lot of bad opinions that come out of the Ninth Circuit. That's why they get turned over at a rate higher than any other circuit in the nation, and it's legitimate to talk about that. But the Chief Justice is right. We don't have Obama judges and Bush judges or Trump judges or Carter or Reagan judges. We have judges in the American system, and they take on a black robe where they're supposed to shield their partisan preferences. They're not red or blue state judges. They're judges. And so when the American people want to affirm a constitutional system where the Article 3 branch, which is where the judiciary sits, when they have lifetime appointments, that's because we believe they're supposed to lay down their partisan preferences. So when the president wants to critique bad judging, he should get at the merits of critiquing the particulars of a bad ruling, and he should help explain to our kids why we think we shouldn't have Obama judges and Trump judges. We should have people who are impartial. That's why they wear a black robe. That's why they don't run for election. So we need to do a better job of teaching basic American civics. And I think the Chief Justice's statement was right about what we want the next generation to understand about why we have three separate but equal branches that check and balance one another.
All right, Senator, let's turn now to your new book. How do you explain the growing political tribalism in this country?
We have an epidemic of loneliness in this country, and one of the things we're not doing well is putting politics in its proper place. So we're turning upside down the pyramid of attachments that should matter in people's lives. Politics matter, but politics can't come first. If politics come first in your life, something's wrong with you. It's a sad thing. And so the most basic relationships in American life are supposed to be with your family, with your friends, with your neighborhood, at your local place of worship, and at your workplace. And right now we're living through a digital revolution that is undermining place. This stuff isn't about the last 2 years. There are a whole bunch of people who watch cable news all day, every day, who want to hyperventilate about politics every minute. There's something wrong when that's happening. What's going on in America right now isn't because of President Trump. He didn't cause it. He can't fix it. This isn't the last 2 years or the next 2 years. This is the last couple of decades and the coming couple of decades. And this digital revolution is something we need to wrestle with because it's bigger than our politics, but it's warping our politics as well.
As you know, our next guest in the next segment, Trump outside advisors Corey Lewandowski and David Bossie have written a new book called Trump's enemies, which seems to speak exactly to this divide, to this tribalism. In the book, they say this about Republican senators Corker, Flake, and a fellow you may know named Ben Sasse. Some Republicans who were not brave enough to run against Trump for president occupy some of the loudest of the enemies of the president. And they also write about political treason. Question, Senator Sasse, how do you plead?
Yeah, I hope you'll get them to define their terms. So republics aren't healthy when people use words like treason about policy debates. That's a pretty messed up worldview. So the most fundamental things in life are about the people who love you and who are going to comfort you in your old age. What is politics about? Politics is about maintaining a framework for ordered liberty so that people can live in the neighborhoods and the communities that they live in. So I haven't seen their book yet. I've never met Corey Lewandowski. I've met David Bossie before. He seems like a nice guy. But language about enemies and treason, about policy and politics, is pretty warped. And I think most Americans think it's weird. When you look at the small subset of people who put politics at the center of their lives, they tend to be really, really lonely. Most healthy people want to coach Little League. They want to go to their church, and they want to have great coworkers at the office, and they want to put on face paint when Nebraska's playing football on Saturdays. That's the most natural way to live. And then you want politicians to do a limited number of things to maintain a framework for ordered liberty, and then they should go back home. And one of the fundamental problems we have in this country is a political class of people who are so obsessed with politics that when they go to Washington, they never actually plan to leave. That's why I'm for term limits. That's why it's messed up that 5 of the 7 richest counties in America are the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where the lobbyists live. I think the vast majority of 320 million Americans want politics to be put back in a proper place, not to be at the center of people's worldview.
Senator Sasse, thank you. Thanks for your time this holiday weekend, and please come back, sir.
Thanks, Chris.
President Trump enters the second half of his term facing many challenges, but is one of the biggest coming from inside his own White House. Joining me now for their first interview, the authors of the new book, Trump's Enemies, How the Deep State is Undermining the Presidency. The president's first campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, now senior advisor to the vice president's PAC, Great America Committee, and former Trump deputy campaign manager, David Bossie. David, Corey, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. I want to start with the title of your book, Trump's Enemies, in which you include, among his enemies, not only Democrats, but the intelligence community, the administrative state, the media, and the establishment. Corey, is that really how you see the world of politics in Washington? You just heard Ben Sasse call that a warped, weird, lonely view of the world.
Well, I respect Senator Sasse, but what he has to acknowledge is that the attacks that this president has faced since the day that he won the election in November of 2016 have been unprecedented. And those attacks have come from the media, the Republican establishment who never supported candidate Trump and still by and large don't support Donald Trump, even though he's taken over the Republican Party, and then many others. And so what we outline, and the intelligence community, and the big part of what we outline in this book is how the intelligence community went after the president through the FISA application process and those individuals who worked on the campaign because they simply disagreed with his political philosophy. And that should be a very scary thing for every American.
We're going to get into the Russia investigation in a bit, but you also go after people, David, who are working for the president. You write this: some of the people in the White House, it is now becoming clear, couldn't and shouldn't be trusted. And you name specifically former economic advisor Gary Cohn, former spokesperson Sean Spicer, as members of what you call the November 9th Club, people who turned magically into Trump supporters after he was elected. David, you write that they wanted to control the president instead of, as you said in your first book, to let Trump be Trump.
Exactly. Let me just step back for one moment, and that is, let's remember what is going on here. There's a vast left-wing conspiracy going on that has been going on since the president won this election, all throughout the transition and during his first 2 years. A vast left-wing conspiracy. Very similar words I'm using to what Hillary Clinton called the vast right-wing conspiracy
Which
against
incidentally
Bill Clinton.
didn't turn out to be true.
No, it did turn out. Chris, there was an effort by the conservative movement to undermine President Clinton that
I
led to
understand,
the
but he
impeachment.
did have a relationship with Monica Lewinsky.
No, of course he did. But what we're saying here in the book is the media, the Republican establishment, and the intelligence services, not together, but separately, are undermining this president. And that is what this book, Trump's Enemies, is about.
But the Republican establishment is not left-wing. The intelligence community is not necessarily left-wing. The administrative state isn't necessarily.
McCabe.
And neither is the
Comey,
media.
Strzok, Page. We can go down the list of all of those within the DOJ and the FBI that undermine this presidency from the beginning. They undermined him during the campaign. They were using illegal operations against him.
But how about the people inside the White House?
Oh, Chris, this is a very important point. Look, we have seen individuals who, my guess is, not only do they not support him when he was running, but probably didn't vote for him on Election Day 2 years ago. Look, I'm sure Gary Cohn didn't vote for him, and there are other people who have been defined as globalists. And there were many individuals who fought hard to get into the White House, who did everything they could prior to him getting elected to keep him from being in the White House. And what we do is we call these people out because it's the right thing to do. The people who didn't support his agenda, and this is not dissimilar from what Melania Trump has said, that there are still people inside the building who they don't trust. And President Trump said in his own interview recently that there are people in the building who he cannot trust. And I hope
and we
that
still
those
don't know
changes
who wrote the anonymous letter. I mean, clearly, Chris, we don't necessarily know who they are, but there are people inside the White House who understand and are for this president's agenda, and there are those who are there for their own agenda.
All right, Corey, I'm going to ask you about somebody very specific. You, in your book, go after the current White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, who you say as recently as August wouldn't let the two of you walk around the West Wing without a formal escort. Is Kelly one of the people that you believe is undermining the president?
Well, I respect John Kelly for his service to the country. And as long as the president wants to keep him as his chief of staff, that'll be his prerogative. But to say that Dave and I, two people who have been unresolved in our support for the president, to have an escort which almost nobody else has to have, I think is a little bit out of bounds. And look, we have been individuals who support the president's work on television, in op-eds across the board, and to call into question our ability to walk around the campus of the White House, I think is something that should be addressed.
David?
No, it's unfortunate. I completely respect General Kelly, and I respect that the president wants to keep General Kelly there. It is unfortunate that General Kelly doesn't utilize us as much as we think he should. It's his prerogative, and he is in that job, and we respect the job that he has done. I wish that there were people within the White House structure that cared as much about their own jobs as they did about the midterms, or they cared about the midterms as much as they did their own jobs. The failure of the midterms shows what we left on the table, I think.
I just want to get back to Kelly for a moment. Do you believe that he is one of those people, Corey, who is trying to control the president, channel the president, rather than let Trump be Trump?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we would have very different management styles, and the management style that John implemented when he became the chief of staff was one where to limit the access to the president, to make sure that there's protocols and procedures, and I think candidly that was needed when he came into the White House. But I also think you have a president who wants access to individuals, who wants to take phone calls, and in our book, look, we interview him, and he says, nobody calls me, I don't get my messages. That is a failure somewhere in the staff chain that the president doesn't have the right to get to the people who are trying to reach him. And I don't know where that failure is, but ultimately that should be resolved.
I know you don't want to answer this question, but I'm going to ask you it anyway. Did you get into a physical altercation with John Kelly this last winter that had to be broken up by the Secret Service? Yes or no?
Well, the Secret Service didn't break anything up. John and I had a very candid discussion, as he probably has many times with the president. The difference is...
Did he grab you?
Look, I don't want to get into what John may or may not have done, but what I do think is he understands that my position is to support the president and the president's agenda all the time.
David, you saved your toughest words for the Russia investigation. I want to put up some of what you said. You write, the upper echelons of the intelligence community and federal law enforcement have waged a full-on war against the president. And you say former FBI Director James Comey set in motion a conspiracy that would seek to cause critical damage to the presidency?
I think that that's well established now. I think what James Comey did as FBI director is shameful. I think that I know James Comey long before he was FBI director. I respect him. I respected him for a long time, and I thought he was one of the good guys. What I saw happen inside the FBI, whether it was his field line agents, whether it was Strzok and Page, the McCabe operation, or his leaking of information, or dumping that fake Russian dossier on the table to show then President-elect Trump, that then really spun this out of control. I think he was irresponsible, and I wish that the president had fired him on day one instead of, sometime in May. The president felt like he wanted to give the FBI director a chance, and I think that is unfortunate.
All right, we're running out of time, and I want to get to a couple of more questions. The bottom line issue is whether or not this kind of us versus them view of politics is useful, serves the president, or whether in fact it jeopardizes his chances for re-election. And let's take a look at the midterms you talked about. House Democrats picked up at least 38 seats. Suburban women went for Democrats, 57% to 38. Independents supported Democrats, 43% to 33. Corey, there's no question the president's base is rock solid. The question is, he hasn't done enough to expand his base.
Look, I think what the president has done as it relates to the economy and jobs are all going to be a reminder when he's on the ballot. And the individuals who are running in some of these places ran away from the president, which I think was a mistake, particularly in some of those House seats. When you look at where the president campaigned the most, whether it was Georgia or Indiana or in Florida, those candidates were winning time and time again because the Republicans and the independents came out and supported those candidates, which I think by extension was the Trump agenda.
Okay, but there are other places where Republicans didn't win. And I want to talk, let's put this up on the screen. These are places where Republicans lost. Democrats won races for senator and governor in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. David, I don't have to tell you, if the president doesn't carry those three states in 2020, he doesn't get reelected.
Well, we're going to make sure that he works hard in those states. We're going to be helping at every step of the way. But if you read our book, Trump's Enemies, and the interview we did with the president talks about the fake news divisions. Not that the media is the enemy of the people, but that the fake news is.
Except he basically says fake news is everybody.
Fake news is all over the place because if you look at what's gone on across this country, he is, I believe, one of the greatest things, and I agree with the president, one of the great things he's done as president is educate the American people about what's going on in the fake news. And I think he is going up against, you talk about that map, he's going up against the entire establishment of the Washington Democratic Party and the media. He has a big hill to climb, and he is going to do it because he's going to tell the American people about his incredible list of accomplishments and where
his presidency he says he has to overcome. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Jonah Goldberg of the National Review, Mo Elleithee of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service, Adrian Elrod, former advisor to Hillary Clinton's campaign, and editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon, Matthew Continetti. So, Jonah, in the first half hour, we heard two very different descriptions and analyses of our politics. You have Bossie and Lewandowski who talk about Trump's enemies, and it's not just Democrats, it's the establishment, the deep state, the intelligence community, the media. And then you have Ben Sasse, who calls that kind of view of the world warped and weird. Where do you come down?
Oh, I'm very much on Team Sasse when it comes to this one. I think Ben Sasse's book is great about how it pinpoints that most of our problems in our politics are upstream of Washington. We have problems in civil society, we have problems in institutions. And if you listen to Dave Bossie and Corey Lewandowski, and I'm an old friend of Dave Bossie's, they exhibit the exact problem. They are actually endorsing this idea that even Trump supporters are secret enemies if they only started supporting the president after the election. If you took their advice at face value, they actually want the Republican coalition to be even smaller than it is, and it is already melting away big chunks. It's like Arctic ice caps just melting away under Donald Trump, and they want to define the Republican Party as blind support for one man rather than a whole group of ideas, and I think that's a suicidal choice.
Mo, in just the past week, the president fought with the Chief Justice, his own CIA, the fake news media, the special counsel. He says, though, if he doesn't fight, he doesn't win.
Yeah, I think the president, there are a lot of fissures in our politics and our society today. And they're not just ideological. It's not left versus right. There's urban versus rural. There's people versus the elites, what have you. And there's a lot of reasons we can get into as to why that is. There's two ways out of it. One is to try to mend those fissures, and the other is to exacerbate them for political gain. And that's what the president's doing. The president is finding the weak spots, and he's jumping in, and he's using it to his political advantage to try to undermine the credibility of the media, to undermine the credibility of the courts, to undermine the credibility of just about every institution, because that's how he got elected. We can be better as a civil society. We can be better, and we need to be better if we're going to heal some of these fissures. We need to do a better job of listening to people on the other side. We need to do a better job of understanding people on the other side. What we don't need to do is vilify people on the other side. It's what the president complained about during the campaign, yet here he is doing it to the umpteenth degree.
But, Matt, I mean, look at Trump's immediate predecessor, Barack Obama, and Lord knows there wasn't lollipops and unicorns in Washington then. And in fact, the president said at the end of his term, one of his great failures was he failed to unify the country. So I think putting this all on Trump isn't really fair.
I agree. I mean, I think President Obama, of course, did criticize judges, his famous rebuke of the Supreme Court after the Citizens United decision. He did criticize media, specifically this network. So this is larger than President Trump. What's happened, I think, is twofold. The first is our politics is less and less about who gets what, and it's more about much larger concepts like values, principles, rights. And when politics is about that, then the arguments are much more vicious and much more sustained. And the second thing that's happened, Chris, is technology. You know, we call it social media, but it's actually quite depersonalizing. And once you're on these social networks, I think you feel liberated to really show your worst self. And so when I'm looking to how we can kind of change things, I think it's human person-to-person contacts. And I saw that recently with Dan Crenshaw, the congressman, who went on SNL after he was insulted, and even Carlos Curbelo, who actually met with someone who had threatened his life, and they ended up holding a joint press conference together.
Adrian, you know, this has been building for decades, and you could talk about a lot of the outside politics issues like social media, like all news cable and all a variety of things. But I mean, I remember vividly during when Clinton was president, Clinton derangement syndrome. And then after the 2000 election, there was Bush derangement syndrome. And it just seems to have started a long time ago, but if anything, to have gotten worse.
Yeah, but I think this president has taken it to a whole new level. And to the point that Matthew just made, I do think social media has just heightened and highlighted more of what has actually been going on out there. Everybody can be their own pundit, right, on Twitter. So, and we're hearing more from people who are on social media more than we did before social media existed. So, you know, we're dealing with, in my opinion, the most uncivil president of the United States that we've ever had. He is doing nothing to try to fix this problem. He attacks the media every day. He exacerbates tribalism. Do
you not remember Clinton derangement syndrome? Do you not remember Obama derangement syndrome?
Yes,
Bush. I mean, from the moment that George W. Bush 43 was elected in 2000, and understandably it was a contested election, a lot of people thought he wasn't the legitimate president.
Look, and a lot of this, President Trump, to a large extent, is a byproduct of what has been growing to this point, right? He was elected president when we've had such a divided country, but instead of actually trying to bring both sides together, he's only further dividing. So again, I think if we want to restore civility, we need to start from the top, and that needs to be coming from the president of the United States.
Matt?
Well, I mean, again, I think this is larger than Trump. One other thing that is, I think, particularly worrisome to me anyway, is that the polarization, I actually don't think most Americans are polarized, but the polarization in the political class is now taking on a geographic dimension. And so if you look at those election results, what did we see? We saw suburbs voting like suburbs, whether they were in the north or the south. This is something new. We saw rural areas voting like rural areas, whether they're in the Midwest or the West or in the South. And so now the key factor in our politics isn't so much regional, it's density. It's how many people are around you. And the more people that are around you, the more likely you are to be liberal. Once these geographic cleavages emerge, Chris, I think they're very difficult to resolve.
But it's also the case that our politics is being nationalized, where it used to be most of what you got out of politics was at the local or community level. And now, because of the nature of media, because we now see presidents, whether liberal or conservative or liberal, we see them as symbols of a culture war. And we invest in them, as Matt was saying, these abstract principles. So we live in an era of very high negative polarization, which basically says that there are millions of people who say they're Democrats because they hate Republicans. And there are millions of Republicans who say they're Republicans because they hate Democrats. And when you live in that kind of era, the impetus is to do things that simply are considered wins if they make the right people angry.
Right.
And Donald Trump has tapped into that very well.
Let me go into this. I was in Missouri a couple of weeks ago talking to a largely Republican crowd, and while they supported a lot of what President Trump did, they came up to me afterwards, a lot of them. I was surprised how many, and said, how do we bring it back? How do we make our country less divisive, where it's, one versus another? Tribes. And I didn't have a good answer. Do you?
I don't know that there is a good answer, other than we all have to, as individuals, those people you talk to have to take responsibility themselves for it. Look, there was a survey.
But they're going about their lives. They're selling insurance or working at the bank or whatever.
Part of the challenge, we were talking about this in the green room earlier, sociologists have been talking for quite some time about this phenomenon called the Great Sort, where people are moving into communities where they are surrounded by people who think and sound like they do, increasingly so. That's spreading into other aspects of our lives. We go to work surrounded by people who think and sound like we do, and we go to school surrounded by people who think and sound like we do, and we get our news from information sources that reinforce what we already think. And our social media feeds absolutely are populated by people who think and sound like we do, to the point where we are isolating ourselves, number one, from different perspectives, and number two, disparaging those different perspectives when we hear them. There's got to be a point where there was a poll recently where parents, for the first time, are more offended by the idea of their children marrying outside of their political party than outside of their race or their faith. Now, I guess on some warped level you can call that progress.
I was going to say, that's
right? Right, that is progress. But at the same time, to be offended by your child marrying outside of your political persuasion, that's not something Washington is going to fix.
All right.